Okay guys, here we are again with modernism, this lecture. Make sure to take notes. Okay, these three statements about modernism are pretty important. The first, modernist author Virginia Woolf will claim that on or about December 1910, human nature changed. Kind of unlike with Victorianism, where we talked about how that evolved from Romanticism, modernism makes a huge break with everything that came before it. They are really going to reject Victorianism, everything they thought about it, and so we're going to see a stark contrast with Victorianism. And the next two statements are very important. Write them down. I can almost assure you they will be on an exam. Virginia Woolf also tells people, look within. Focus on the individual experience, on the interior, and on the psychological. Ezra Pound will say, make it new. Make something new. Make something different. Make something nobody has ever seen before. These are things that the modernists really valued and will achieve. Okay, so now we get into the background. When is modernism? The Edwardian period, named after King Edward, is from 1901 to 1910. The Georgian period is technically from 1910. He reigns until 1936. But we only think of the Georgian period as from 1910 to 1914 because that's when World War I starts. These periods, Edwardian and Georgian, usually fall through the cracks between discussions of Victorianism and modernism. We had talked in the previous unit about the fin de siècle. Virginia Woolf says modernism starts right in 1910. Most people are going to date it from about 1914. The start of World War I. Because World War I will also represent a huge break with everything that came before it. So essentially, when we talk about the modernist period, we're going to say 1914 to 1950 or so. And after that, 1950 until perhaps now, we have a period that we will call post-modern. And I'll tell you much more about that at a later time. So this gives you a more sense of the dates when this is. Modernism, a time of isms. During this period, we will see a number of different movements in art, in literature, in politics. Not all of these are as important as they're not all equally important, and you don't have to know the names of all of these, but everybody's reinventing things, or everybody's inventing new things, I should say. People are, and artists are focusing on new ideas. Imagism is a specific one that we will talk about. And they're not just movements in art and literature. For example, German Expressionism is also a movement in film. We have a new medium in modernism, the film. Cubism is a movement in art. The last two are quite important, and we'll talk about them at later times. Communism and fascism. Dominant political movements during the first half of the 20th century. So, a lot of upheaval in thought. Who are the modernists? The modernists that we will be talking about initially, often called high modernists, would be Virginia Woolf, James Joyce Yates, Eliot, Ezra Pound, D.H. Lawrence. Auden's actually more of a late modernist. Now, and this is an international movement, and it reflects the globalization of the 20th century. Joyce is Irish, Yates is Irish. Eliot and Pound are born in America. Eliot goes to England. He will live the rest of his life in England. Pound will travel the continent of Europe. D.H. Lawrence will go the reverse way. He'll go to ultimately end up in Mexico and western part of America. Auden is an English citizen who will go to America and spend the rest of his life in America. But so we have a lot of movement between countries, between cultures. This is also a real sign of the 20th century, how international it is, how global it is. Okay, like Victorianism, modernism usually gets divided up into little sections. We'll be starting with high modernism, about 1910, 1920s, Woolf, Joyce, Pound, Eliot, Yates. This is analogous in American literature to when they're talking about the Lost Generation, right around that area. Late modernism, 30s, 40s. And so we'll see late modernists, and some people straddle both eras. Right? Eliot is going to produce literature in high modernism and in late modernism. We will see some people straddle both eras. Evelyn Waugh kind of straddles both eras, actually. So there's also it can be divided along a political axis. Pound, Eliot, Waugh, Yates are all extreme. Well, they're pretty conservative, and they will support in their lifetimes right-leaning and fascist governments. Auden and Orwell support left-leaning communist governments at various points in their lifetime. Right, when the kind of struggle that we see between fascism and communism in the 20s and 30s, and a little bit into the 40s, that's kind of the dominant political struggle at that point, certainly in Europe. We will see people basically take sides on that. Okay, history that informs this movement. A lot of revolution. World War I and its aftermath. The Easter Rising of 1916 in Ireland, followed by the Anglo-Irish War. The Russian Revolution of 1917. The Great Depression. Sometimes in America we forget that the Great Depression was a global event, and that other countries had their own Great Depression or a Great Recession, and were suffering economically in the 1930s. The rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s, and the Spanish Civil War. So these are all historical, political movements that are going to inform a great deal of the literature that we'll read. It is very hard to overstate the effect that World War I had on society and culture. Now, you can think in your own lives about the effect that an event like 9/11 has had on America. I think approximately 3,000 people were killed on 9/11. And there were all kinds of deep national effects. 3,000 people out of a country of approximately 330 million. In World War I, 11% of the entire population of France was killed. 8% of the population of Great Britain was killed. 9% of the whole population of the country of Germany was killed. And you look at the percentage of people who were killed in the United States. Now, the United States doesn't join the war until 1917. Right? We're not in the war as long, but it also isn't happening in our country, and our losses are nowhere near as severe. I mean, we're talking about countries that were basically decimated. And think about the effects that would have on you. You would not know anybody who didn't suffer a loss, a father, a brother, a cousin, an uncle. Everybody would have either suffered some kind of loss or know someone who had in World War I. It is unbelievably costly in terms of lives lost. And this is a dramatic difference that we have not really seen in warfare until now. That's why they call it, they called it, until World War II, they called it the Great War, or the war to end all war. World War I also marks the beginning of the end of European hegemony in the world, as many old regimes, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were destroyed by the war. The power relationship and the map of Europe is dramatically changed. So it's really a new era. It's the end of an old era, is what I should say. This is a excerpt from Vera Britton's diary autobiography. She worked as a nurse in a nurse's aide in World War I, and she's writing home to her mother about what it's like to see somebody who has been a victim of mustard gas. It's very dramatic. Mustard gas was used, biochemical warfare was used in World War I. And we'll see in Wilfred Owen's poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, he'll talk about a soldier who's been gassed. This was so horrible, and it was so awful, that basically most countries decided they would never use this kind of weapon again. And we have a lovely picture by John Singer Sargent of soldiers who have suffered a gas attack. You get blinded. That's why you can see their blindfolds, and they're being led by people. You can see the way that they're walking. They're being led by people. These are soldiers, also victims, who are not well enough. These guys are being led to a hospital tent, and you can see another group of people being led to a hospital tent. You get a sense, this painting gives you a sense of the vast numbers of casualties that were inflicted. So, yes, hard to overstate the effect that World War I had on modernist authors.